Tonight, I'm excited to welcome Eliza Griswold to Harvard Bookstore to discuss the 10th parallel, Dispatches from the Fault Line Between Christianity and Islam. Ms. Griswold is a fellow at the New America Foundation and was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard in 2007. She was awarded the first Robert I. Friedman Award for Investigative Reporting and a Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, and Harper's, and Wide Awake Field, a collection of her poetry, was published in 2007. In the 10th parallel, Ms. Griswold explores the geographical and cultural boundary between the Christian and Islamic worlds. Through profiles of terrorists, missionaries, aid workers, and a cast of other characters, Ms. Griswold shows readers the causes and consequences of a conflict playing out across much of Africa and Asia. Reza Aslan, author of No God But God, called it one of the most important books you will ever read, and the New York Times Book Review called The 10th Parallel a fascinating journey, beautifully written and full of arresting stories woven around a provocative issue.
It is such an honor to be here. After ghosting around Harvard Square thinking this book would never be done when I was a Nieman Fellow, to actually walking through with a copy of it is a change. And before reading to you a little bit, I just want to give a huge shout out to the world's finest research assistant and general editor, who's sitting right here, Rachel Nolan, who fact-checked this book within within an ounce of its life, and then would also say when entire sections were so boring they just had to be cut. So politely by Skype from Mexico City to Rome, we did a lot of it. So I'm very grateful she's here with her mother. So anyway, so this book began out of, it started in 2003. I went with Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son, who is head of about a $500 million evangelical empire, to Sudan. And Graham had worked in Sudan already for 2 decades. He'd worked in the south, but he had never been to the north. And he was going to the north to meet with a man he called just as evil as Saddam Hussein, if not more so, President Bashir, who is currently the president of Sudan, who is the only president who has been indicted for war crimes and is still a standing president. So he is still the president of Sudan, which is Africa's largest country. I think I'm a little taller than this. That's all right. So Graham was going to meet Bashir. And this meeting was really about, Graham wanted the right to proselytize among Muslims in northern Sudan. And the Christians have not been allowed to preach in the north to Muslims since 1904, since the British drew a line along the 10th parallel, along this line of latitude, making it illegal for Christian missionaries to travel to the north to work among Muslims. Why? Because the British Empire had already faced a huge and incredibly shaming defeat at the hands of an Islamic rebellion in the late 1800s in Sudan. And that thinking, actually, that early encounter with Islam, really shaped a lot of colonial policy toward the religion, and still we see that really a lot of that thinking, we are certainly seeing it today, that sort of resurgent Islam is the enemy and we must mobilize against it. So, a word on this fault line. I think I must have learned in about 3rd grade that lat is flat, so latitude here is a horizontal entity. All these lines are imaginary, but that's just too confusing for such a talk. So here's the equator. The 10th parallel is 700 miles to the north of it. I traveled for 7 years within this space, within this 700-mile, 9,000 mile long, 700 miles rectangle, really, to see what happens when Christianity and Islam meet on the ground. And the single most galvanizing fact for me in beginning the reporting of this book was that 4 out of 5 of the world's 1.3 billion Muslims do not live in the Middle East. They are not Arabs. They are Africans and they are Asians. And I wanted to go to see what happens on the ground when the southern edge of the Muslim world meets about half of the world's 2 billion Christians. What happens in droughts, floods, megacities, slums? What happens when religion comes to bear on conflicts over land, oil, water, sometimes even crops of cacao, the main ingredient in chocolate? what happens when religion comes into these conflicts, and largely examples of coexistence, because there was tons of that in my travels. So I went with Graham to Sudan in 2003, and he went to meet with his president, Bashir, who the two men are not friends. And they sat down together, and I sat down with them and watched them try to convert each other to their respective faiths. And that was not hugely successful. And so what happened is many of us were ushered out into the driveway, and Franklin Graham told me later that he remembered he had something in the pocket of his blue blazer. So he reached into his pocket and pulled out a George W. Bush 2004 re-election pin, because this was the fall of 2003, and he had pulled the pin from Karl Rove's secretary's desk, and he handed it to Bashir, and he said, "Mr. President, I understand you'll be talking to my president later today. Why don't you tell him you're his first voter here in the Sudan?" So what was that about? That was about saying to Bashir, if you don't want to be the next rogue Muslim regime on America's hit list after Afghanistan and Iraq, listen to me. I am close to President Bush. So that is how faith and foreign policy, in particular evangelical policies, have come to bear on American foreign policies in ways that we don't usually hear a great deal about. So after that encounter, Franklin Graham went back to a guest house where he was staying with about a dozen of... There are a couple of chairs up here if anyone wants to sit down. Feeling invaded. If anyone wants to sit down, there are chairs. So he went back to the guest house, the government guest house where he was staying, and he held a small prayer meeting for Christian leaders, Sudanese Christian leaders, and I was standing in the back with my notebook as a reporter and lowered my head without thinking it, bowed my head to pray when Graham asked us all to pray, and that provoked a question from his number two, from a man who works with Graham quickly after that. So I thought what I would do is read you that section, and we will take it from there. Okay. In the hallway, a few minutes after the prayer meeting, Ken Isaacs, Graham's second-in-command, a tall, hard-jawed North Carolinian who would go on to head the U.S. Office of Disaster Assistance under President Bush, approached me and asked, "What's your background?" "Originally, I came from Philadelphia," I told him. "That's not what I meant," he said. "Was I a believer or not? Salvation was absolute, saved or damned. There was no in-between. Which was I?" To me, the question required a more complex answer. I was raised as the daughter of an Episcopal priest and grew up in a rectory in suburban Philadelphia during the 70s and 80s, a particularly progressive moment for the church. Worship included Passover seders, Jesus Christ Superstar, and doing the crop hunger walk, as well as gathering around an altar and eating homemade organic wheat bread as the Eucharist. This was the bustling, clamorous world of public religion. Talking and listening to God involved a quiet conversation, and words I was sure were the way to reach his ear. For me as a 6-year-old girl, going out to play often meant sneaking next door to the dark, cool church. I learned to read by standing at the pulpit and practicing the Bible's cadences out over the empty pews. I saw the Bible sitting open on the brass lectern, a red satin ribbon marking the page, as a book of spells, one whose extravagant metaphors, whose terrible and powerful parables were ways of calling God to earth. In college, 15 years later, I read the work of the 20th century Romanian historian and theologian Mircea Eliade. When I came across his concept of hierophany, the spaces where the sacred and secular worlds meet and peoples attempt to create them through ceremony, I understood what I had been up to as a child. At Sunday school, a boy my age once asked me if my father was God. "No, he's God's best friend," I replied. I saw my loving, distant, distractible father caught between two worlds. One was a place of worldly decisions and unexpected telephone calls. Once I watched him rip the rectory's black rotary phone right off the wall. The other was a sacred realm in which he was a servant, not a leader. When I was 12, he was elected the Episcopal Bishop of Chicago, and so we moved from a Philadelphia suburb to the urban shore of Lake Michigan. At his consecration, the rite in which a person formally offers himself to God, or herself to God as a bishop, my father, following long tradition, lay face down on the cathedral floor with his legs extended and arms outstretched, his body forming the shape of a cross. There was something about this act of utter surrender that terrified and angered me. What right had God and the several thousand Midwestern strangers in the pews to demand my father's life? When are they going to let Dad up? I asked my mother. Although I feared for my father, I also feared for myself. What did God want from us, anyway? As a teenager, I grew petrified of God's will. What if he were to swoop down and ask me to submit also? What could faith cost me? It could cost me myself, I concluded. Frankly, I was afraid God would ask me to be a nun. My father's uncompromising commitment to the articles of his faith proved difficult for me to reconcile with his progressive values and his critical intelligence. I spent those years wondering how it was that smart people could believe in God. When I traveled with Franklin Graham to Sudan 16 years later, my father was serving as the presiding bishop. The consecration of Gene V. Robinson, an openly homosexual bishop, nearby in New Hampshire, I'm sure most people here are familiar with him, had just taken place, upsetting not only African bishops, but also conservative American evangelicals such as Graham, with the blessing it obviously conferred on homosexuality. This was evidence to them of the lethal moral lassitude of the West, where whole churches were bent on denying God's will as revealed by Scripture. For Graham, the contemporary confrontation with Islam was sharpening the Christian faith, giving it moral fortitude. Western sinfulness and moral slackness were weakening the faith worldwide, and Christianity needed the West to shape up if it was going to win the fight. But for Graham, as for others, the consecration of Gene Robinson as the Bishop of New Hampshire was not just a sign of weakness, of falling away from the old true faith. It was a full-on repudiation of the sexual morality that some Christian evangelicals believed set them apart from others. As such, it marked a divide among Protestants worldwide over what it meant to be a Christian, over whether progressives or conservatives had the right to speak in the name of God. The Reverend Franklin Graham and the presiding Bishop Frank Griswold stood on opposite sides of this divide, and the gap between them was widening. And I was the presiding bishop's daughter. "You have 30 seconds to tell Franklin," his number 2, Ken Isaac, said. Graham was in the dining room eating a lunch of oxtail soup with 12 members of his entourage. In the doorway, I hesitated. 13 seconds, Isaac said, standing behind me. I sat down at the table and told Graham who my father was. Graham listened, then looked at me and flashed a smile, not the familiar high-watt public beam, but a private and mischievous grin. He and I were kin, for although we were raised with very different understandings of what it meant to be a Christian, we were fellow PKs, or preacher's kids, modeled sheep who had grown up caught between religious parents and private rebellion. But that's where our similarity ended. As far as he was concerned, the fact I had not accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior meant I was going to hell. There is no middle ground. Salvation is black and white, Graham told me. He had made this choice for Christ himself. Why hadn't I? I asked him to clarify. What did he mean by praying to Jesus? How was that different from praying to God? The clatter of soup spoons ceased. Graham looked at me and said, "Jesus is the only one who died for our sins. Muhammad didn't do that. Buddha died still searching for truth." He quoted what I later learned was the gospel according to John 14, verse 6. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." There was only one way to be saved and to be assured a place in heaven, through faith in Jesus Christ. "If your plane crashes tomorrow," he asked, "are you absolutely sure you'll go to heaven?" I thought for a moment. "No. Would you be willing to pray with me now?" Okay, so I'm stopping there. So that better sell a book or two, people. Just to be clear, I mean, one thing about reading that section is that, that is the only personal section in the book. The book really, in the book, I travel from Nigeria to Sudan, to Somalia and Ethiopia, on eastward to Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And the reason that Islam and Christianity meet within this band has different factors to it. One reason is that centuries of human migration have created this fault line. Another is that both wind and other forms of weather contribute to the geography itself that has created this natural fault line. So if one envisions Africa and the northernmost third being very dry, right, we're looking at a desert. Where the desert ends and basically the dry, arid land ends and the wet land, the jungle begins, that's the 10th parallel. Where the wet begins, so do tsetse flies, and tsetse flies carry sleeping sickness. And so through the 1800s, when Muslim missionaries and traders carried the faith south, all over the northernmost third of Africa, they got as far south as the 10th parallel. But when they hit the 10th parallel, their camels and horses were killed off by sleeping sickness. And there, inland Africa in particularly, Islam stopped. In the very late 19th century and early 20th, with the arrival of European colonization, in these same borderlands, there was a very, very developed awareness that this 10th parallel was the dividing line where Islam stopped. And in particular, evangelical missionaries came along with the European colonialists, and they some of them decided to make mission stations explicitly along the 10th parallel to stop Islam from winning the continent. And we hear echoes of a lot of this language today, this binary division between good and evil, darkness and light, the saved and the damned. When I began reporting this book, the essential question I began with was, does fundamentalism, does the belief that there is one and only one way to reach God inherently lead to violence? Because if there's one way to reach God, that means that everyone else is a sinner at best, evil at worst. And what does that kind of binary thinking, that kind of dichotomy, set up in ideology and then set up to unleash itself in practical ways on the ground? So after 7 years, so what I would do, I would go and do a chunk of this reporting, and then I would come back. In particular, I would use Widener. I came back from Nigeria, having come across some Nigerian Christians who are very, very much believe that they are at war with Islam and have historically been minorities before they were Christians. They followed indigenous religions, and they were enslaved by their Muslim northern neighbors. Many of them have adopted Christianity as a form of liberation. So these guys in a particular church called Kokin, the Church of Christ in Nigeria, told me that the missionary who had come to them, a man named Carl Kum, had brought his Sudan United Mission to explicitly here to stop Islam and taught them this way of thinking, along with health, hygiene, practical ways of survival. It was actually coming back here and finding the Sudan United Mission archives in Lamont. They're only in two places. They're in the UK and they're in Lamont, and digging among the microfilm that I found these records. So I'm incredibly grateful to this community because Harvard basically made it possible for me to keep layering and layering and layering the research. If there's a single takeaway from this book, which there's not, but one of the most prevalent is that the most overlooked religious clash today is not the clash between Christianity and Islam. It is the clash inside of Christianity and inside of Islam. It is the fight between liberals and conservatives and Sunnis, Shias, Sufis, vying on each side over who has the right to speak for God. And it's these struggles inside of religions that will truly determine the future of the faiths. Most recently, I've been a little bit taken back by some of the hunger for some of the stories in this book. And I think one of the reasons that is true is what we see at Ground Zero, what we see on the steps of Lincoln Memorial is really, it's Franklin Graham saying that Barack Obama is not a true Christian, right? It is this fight inside of Christianity over who is a true believer and why. So that's a wrestle that I find particularly interesting and particularly relevant to what's going on in this country. We certainly are very familiar with the fact that the quickest way to whip up fear in followers is a common enemy, right? And so although we hear and see a lot of demonization of Islam, or within the Muslim world, a lot of looking at this monolithic Christian West, the truth is what that really does is it's a power struggle within religions, looking at who's going to win the particular dominant narrative of that respective religion. So it's fun not to have to just speak in the sound bites that I usually have to be like black and white, but dominant narrative here is great. So, okay. So I am going to read you just a little bit more, and then I'm going to knock it off for some questions. And one of the places we need to pay the most attention to this fault line, in fact, I would say right now, without question, the most pronounced division lies in Sudan. And we are starting to hear talk about this upcoming referendum, which is scheduled for January 9th of 2011. It's not going to happen January 9th, but here's what's going on. In 2005, the U.S. helped broker this peace that was an end to 40 years of civil war between North and South. Part of that peace deal was the right for the South, right, which perceives itself as Christian, although it's equally as many animists and people who follow the indigenous faith, was the right for the South to vote for its own independence for the first time in history. What Bashir, this has done is in 1989 he declared the modern world's bloodiest jihad in history against Christians and Muslims alike living to the south of the 10th parallel. The inherited history of this, of the rage and self-determination that has sprung up before that too, but as a result of that division and that war, is that the South wants its right to be its own country, and most importantly, it wants right to its own oil. Whether or not this division will mark a return to civil war in Sudan is an open question. It's certainly something we're going to be hearing about a little bit more, I hope quite a lot more, in the coming months. But I thought it would be important to frame it a little bit. So because I told the stories in this book through the lives of people who lived this experience, and really their understandings of the importance of God in their own lives, I see myself in that way like my dad, like a translator. I mean, my job was to go and hear people's experience and bring them back. So I am going to read you just the very beginning of the book, which is one of these voices. This is a man who, I think it's helpful to say, although you won't hear it here, he was very alarmed and afraid that his village was going to be attacked. And so this story is about his alarm. Well, in fact, 3 weeks later, it was attacked. And this place you're going to hear about and these people were wiped off the map. Many of them survived. Many of them have gone back to this same frontline village, which lies right on the 10th parallel. It is the dividing line between North and South. But this is the kind of way in which religion comes to pattern people's lives, where we at a distance say, oh, come on, it's political economy, it's the election, it has nothing to do with God. That is not how people who live this struggle see it. And that really was my job, to bring their stories back. So the chief was spending Easter Sunday in his hut, which smelled of stale smoke from a cooking fire and of something more glandular, panic, when the visitor from Washington ducked inside. The chief, a man in his mid-50s named Nolan Padwat, rose stiff-kneed from a white plastic lawn chair. He had spent several days keeping watch against an approaching dust cloud kicked up by horsemen and jeeps. It would mean his village of Todaj, teetering on the fraught and murky border between northern and southern Sudan, was under attack again. He was grouchy and unkempt, his eyes pouched, his salt and pepper beard scruffy, his waxy green and yellow shirt stained with the tide lines of dried sweat. He glowered at the American visitor, Roger Winter, whose bare legs poked out from khaki shorts. One leg bore the scar of a snake bite he had gotten not far away while helping to broker a peace on behalf of the United States. The 2005 deal was supposed to end nearly 40 years of intermittent civil war between northern and southern Sudan, which had left 2 million people dead. In some places, the peace agreement had staunched the bloodshed, allowing the South to form a nascent government that described itself as Christian-led. Under the terms of the deal, the North was supposed to make it attractive for the South to remain part of a unified Sudan by giving it a voice in the national government and a fair share of oil revenues. But the North ignored most of the terms. The peace deal proved to mean nothing here on the boundary between the two Sudans, which jigs and jags like an EKG reading along the straight, flat latitude of the 10th parallel. The 10th parallel is the horizontal band that rings the Earth 700 miles north of the equator. If Africa is shaped like a rumpled sock, with South Africa at the toe and Somalia at the heel, then the 10th parallel runs across the ankle. Along the 10th parallel in Sudan and in most of inland Africa, two worlds collide. The mostly Muslim, Arab-influenced North meets a black African South inhabited by Christians and those who follow indigenous religions, which include those who venerate ancestors and the spirits of animal, land, and sky. 30 miles south of this divide, at a latitude of 9.5 degrees, the village of Todaj marked the divide where these two rival worldviews, their dysfunctional governments, and well-armed militaries vied inch by inch for land. The village belonged to the South's largest ethnic group, the Nyok-Dinka. But in 2008, when Roger Winter paid Nyol Padwad a visit, the North was threatening to send its soldiers and Arab militias to attack the village and lay claim to the underground river of light, sweet crude oil running beneath the chief's feet. Oil was discovered in southern Sudan during the 1970s, and the struggle to control it is one of the long-running war's most recent causes. The fight in Sudan threatens to split Africa's largest country in two. Okay, in 2011, the South is scheduled to vote on whether it wants to remain part of the North or become its own country, made up of 10 states that lie to the south of the 10th parallel and border Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, and Chad. This looming split, which if it happens, will likely occur along the 10th parallel, means that Todaj and the nearby oil boom town of Abyei, about 10 miles south, are vitally important. Whoever controls them will control an estimated 2 billion barrels of oil. Thank you. Most of the Christians along the 10th parallel very much perceive themselves as a minority faith, long enslaved by Islam, they need the strength of the literal word of the gospel to combat what they see as Islam's moral fortitude. So the understanding is that conservative Americans very much, whether they're Graham or whether they're American Episcopal bishops, are very much understand the truth of their struggle and will help protect them against the secular, degraded West. So that's here's a perfect example. I was driving along a road in eastern Congo, a logging road, a couple of years ago, and there's still a war going on. There was a terrible fight going on. Basically, some rebels had been able to come into a region in the east called the Ituri province because of the logging road. And they had committed some really atrocious and very heinous crimes against humanity. And they had attacked a group of forest dwellers, Pygmies. So I was going to meet with the Pygmies, and it was late at night, and my driver and I got into a conversation about homosexuality, as you do on a Congolese road late at night. And it was one of those moments where I just said, come on, you really don't believe there's ever been homosexuality in Africa? And he said, make no mistake, this is a secular Western import like HIV/AIDS. And we will not tolerate it. And so you and your liberal, he didn't attack me in this way, but liberal Christianity is secularism, and secularism is a threat to us as Islam is. The book started with a trip to Sudan with Billy Graham's son, Franklin. That's really where it started, except that, I was already aware of the importance of the 10th parallel in evangelical circles, because there is very much an idea that this marks the end of the Christian world as we know it, and the beginning of the Muslim world. Also, Buddhists, Hindus all live north of this fault line. I had thought it was a metaphor until I started looking at some of the demographic realities and the geography. I don't think I said, did I say this is where the trade wins in Southeast? I did. Okay. So, forgive me, I am on it in this book tour. It's harder than doing the reporting, I'll be quite honest. I realized today when someone was asking me questions, I prefer to ask the questions. Anyway, So that's really what started it, but I was aware of it as a reality. And I went to Iraq right before the war in 2003 to spend some time with an undercover missionary, a woman who was in an area where it was illegal for her to be proselytizing. And I had thought I was going to do a book about Western missionaries who were working illegally within the Muslim world. And I realized after spending some time with her that not only might that kind of story get her killed, but that what she was really doing was teaching math. And although she yearned to be saving souls, the reality was, and the book gets into a group who runs an aerobic studio who have had this same experience, she hadn't converted anyone. And so the story, I realized pretty quickly, was not with a small handful of Western missionaries in the Muslim world. It was with Africans and Africans, Asians and Asians. So that's kind of how the ball got rolling. No, I thought it was dangerous. There were so many ethical questions that came up reporting this book. I mean, one of the things is, my understanding of the way in which God works, which is something, people, every single interview I did, there is a question people ask me, what do you believe? And I am just at the beginning of what I understand. I mean, some kind of seeker, Christianity is no more relevant to me than, or its mythology makes no more sense to me than Islam or Buddhism. So that's where I am, quite frankly. But when I met with these missionaries who, they run an aerobic studio in Khartoum, I realized, that to write about them, they didn't want to be found. I found them because a heavy smoking northern Sudanese friend of mine goes there to smoke and not be bothered by her family. And I asked, do you know any Westerners doing odd things here? And she thought for a minute. She's like, the aerobic studio. So I had discovered them, and I was not comfortable. Their names aren't in the book, and they're certainly aware what's in the book. So one of the strongest examples I've seen, and one of the most practical, is there's a Nigerian pastor and an imam, and the pastor, James Ashafa, has one arm, and the reason he has one arm is because the imam's boys lopped off the other one in fighting about 15 years ago. They are both self-avowed fundamentalists who believe the other one is going to hell with no questions asked. They are running the most successful interfaith program I have ever seen. So that's one of those continual paradoxes that I came across. The reason it is so successful is because they've introduced always there's a third element. So I have seen a lot of interfaith dialogue that just simply is a waste of time. That's like, I believe this, you do, I believe that. End of conversation.
That's on an individual level. How about on a larger?
On a larger level, I haven't seen it very successful. Where I have seen it work is when this pastor and the imam bring together women, right, who are already invested in the next generation because they've got kids, and even in northern Nigeria, they're less likely to pick up swords, right? They're called cutlasses in northern Nigeria. They don't fight as much as the men do. And one of the things Christians and Muslims fight over in northern Nigeria is firewood, because they need the fuel to survive, to cook their food. So what these guys have done is they've brought stoves, they've brought these low wood-burning stoves and been like, I don't know, you guys work it out. Here's a Christian, here's a Muslim. So when there is a third element introduced, when there is a mutually beneficial means of survival that's brought into a community, I've watched conflict disappear quite quickly. And these guys, they are in a town called Kaduna, which means crocodile, on the 10th parallel. And we've heard so much about the violence in this area, the Middle Belt, not in Kaduna. And it is simply through these community ties, like the Stove Project. Well, I'm going to stick with Nigeria on that answer, because one of the things I think we really could address, people ask me all the time, well, this is great, now what do we do? One of the things we really could do, in northern Nigeria alone, there are about 23 million Muslim kids who go to the equivalent of madrasas. They go to something called al-Majri schools. It's totally informal, and they're free. And the kids travel. Historically, the kids would travel great distances to go study with good teachers. The reason the schools were free is because the teachers ran farms. And so the kids would get their schooling for free, but they'd also be doing the work on the farm. Well, this is one of the areas in the book in which climate change comes into factor in religious conflict in unexpected ways. Because in northern Nigeria, desertification is making it impossible for those farms to function. The teachers have moved south, and they've moved to the edges of major cities. They've moved to slums. Now the kids are employed as beggars. When an election comes up, what Nigerian elections are some of the bloodiest in the world, political leaders will come to the teacher and say, I need 1,000 kids. Here's $100. And the teacher will send them. I've talked to teachers who say, I've got to feed the kids. What do you want them to starve? You think that's better? So this is the only kind of schooling for Muslim youth in northern Nigeria. To begin to address that would make a massive, massive difference. And we could do that. I mean, people are eager for education to come in certain ways. That's exactly what one of the takeaways of this book is, also the idea that I think the world is breaking down on tribal lines, and the greatest of those tribes is religion. And so in this community within the House of Fulani, which is the largest ethnic group in the north, it matters less. This shared bond of tribe or ethnicity matters way less than religion when violence starts. So what is that? Why? Because I've seen it. Religion is the greatest single marker of identity along this fault line, and I would argue that this place is where we're watching patterns that are starting to happen much more in other places. Partly it's the failure of statehood, right? I mean, it's the fact that colonial, leaders drew arbitrary lines on maps and divided people who were never meant to be divided. And so other forms, since the state is rapacious and a failure, people have turned to other forms of identity, and religion above all else. So, well, there's no claim. I would be the last to claim that this is the singular religious fault line of the world. I mean, take Jerusalem. I mean, that's not. Somebody asked me the other day if there were 10th parallels in the United States. That blew my mind. How do other historical realities bear on the contemporary confrontation between Islam and Christianity? In many, many different ways. Let's start with the history here itself. I mean, Muhammad sent his first followers to Africa in 615 AD, in the 7th century. There wasn't even Islam yet. So Muhammad was in Mecca. He was at war with his own people, the Quraysh, who didn't very much like this 40-something charismatic preacher. And he had to leave Mecca, flee to Medina, then Yathrib. He had to flee about 210 miles away, and he sent about a dozen of his followers to the safest place he knew, and that was the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia. That was today's Ethiopia. Why? Because the bond of belief in a shared God was stronger than that of blood and tribe. So there are many, many, many other historical examples of religious cooperation and religious conflict. To even there has been Christianity in Africa, the Sudanese people would claim, since 37 AD, 4 years after Jesus was crucified. So I pretty much had 1,500 years of history here. They definitely inform each other. I think that the way, I grew up writing poetry, and it's really my first love. And journalism came out of a brutal reality that I had to find a way to pay the bills quickly. So I love it. I love writing nonfiction. But what the poetry allows for, and they are related in that first book of poems, Wide Awake Field, there's quite a lot of places that I have been reporting in Afghanistan and Iraq. And usually the poetry becomes a place where things I can't solve, I can't work out on a page in terms of nonfiction, goes to poetry. Unanswerable questions, ways in which I feel implicated. So how do they work practically? Usually, how do they work practically? I write poetry in the morning, and I write it fast. If it's any good, it's fast. If it's bad, it takes a long time. But I have to do it a lot to get a couple of good ones. And I'm almost done a new book. So at least I think I'm almost done that new book. I don't know how my editor feels about it. Okay, so that is it. Thank you so much for coming, and I would be happy to answer your questions while I'm signing your book.